The House of Commons Standing Committee on Government Operations, also known, of course, as the mighty OGGO. Before we start, please, everyone, read your rules regarding keeping your earpiece away from your mic, of course, to protect our very valued interpreters. Try and keep it face down on the sticker. Thank you for your cooperation. Colleagues, just quickly, I hear rumors that there may be a closure vote. We might have bells around 12:30. If we can have UC right now to continue to say about 7 minutes before the actual vote so we can get the meeting in. If there is a vote. 10-2. Sure. If there is a vote. We've got 4 groups of witnesses. One of them's trying to restart their computer right now. The other one might be joining us later. So we are going to start with the opening statements. If the others are able to join in, we'll get to their opening statements. But we'll start
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Miss Atwin, go ahead.
Sorry, there's only audio coming through, but no visual of the committee room.
Oh, that's odd. We see you loud and clear.
Yeah, I can't see anyone from the room.
Is that the same for Miss Kazaya, as I butcher your name?
Yes, yeah, I can't see neither.
Oh, thanks, Miss Atwin, for letting us know. Bear with us 1 second. Or suspend for 2. Oh, we should be good?
Yeah.
Are we okay? Wonderful. Thanks for letting us know. We'll try to restart with, oh, you're out of time, Mr. Girard, sorry. No, we'll start with you, Mr. Girard, for 5 minutes, please. Welcome to OGGO. The floor is yours for 5 minutes, sir.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you.
I'm delighted to have been invited this morning to present to you the kind of the key features of a paper that CG published in July of last year. The title of the paper is squarely framed at the modernization of our regulatory framework in Canada. And the title is Canada Needs Its New Approach to Streamline Digital Rulemaking. Je voulais remercier également
I wanted to thank the committee for having invested resources to have this document translated. So you have it in English and also in French, and it's an excellent translation. I'm very pleased to have had access to that translation.
The paper's focus is about managing safety and innovation in a new world. We now have digital technologies that are clearly outpacing our ability to manage harms through regulations. So the paper is about keeping Canadians safe. And the approach we propose in the paper is to modernize the Statutory Instruments Act. We recommend to formally recognize standards as statutory instruments alongside with regulations. So creating a completely new separate track to achieve compliance with laws alongside with regulations. So the way we look at this, our legislation is about what you need to do and what are the consequences of not complying with a law, the penalties. Regulations are about how to achieve compliance. And we argue that standards developed by accredited organizations are as efficient in achieving this how to comply with the law than regulations. Today, standards are merely a footnote in the Statutory Instruments Act. They are mentioned as one category of documents that can be incorporated in a regulation. So if you were to establish a separate standards tract, you'd give parliamentarians a power tool. You would give them the ability to force standard setting as soon as a new technology is introduced in the marketplace. It would allow ministers to make standardization requests to the Standards Council of Canada, not for voluntary standards, for mandatory standards, so standards that would have force of law once they are developed. Now, let us be clear, it's not about prohibiting the use of new technologies, but it's about establishing clear requirements with industry and other stakeholders through a credible process to make them safe for use. So you'll look at the paper, you'll see we spent about 10 pages describing the standardization system because it's operating under the radar for many of us, including legislators and regulators. In the paper, you'll find that there are more than 6,000 standards referencing federal, provincial, and territorial regulations. So standards that have been used by regulators since 1927 with the introduction of the Canadian Electrical Code. So it's being used to keep Canadians safe when it comes to tangible products. So if you think about electrical safety, plumbing safety, building safety, it's all safety codes, it's all standards. If you add standards in the mandatory codes that are adopted by provinces and territories, as well as the federal government, you're looking at more than 10,000 standards that are used to keep Canadians safe. So it's a parallel system, but it's an invisible system. In Canada, we have more than 10,000 Canadians participating in development and maintenance of standards. That's a lot of people. I would argue that there are more Canadians developing and maintaining standards in this country than there are regulators. We're seeing the same thing when it comes to digital technologies. So here in Ottawa, we have an organization called the Digital Safety Standards Institute, and they develop standards for digital technologies, whether it's AI, electronic wallets, face recognition technologies. You have them everywhere. And we have thousands of Canadians participating in this. The paper shows as well that in Europe, in the US, in the UK, there are processes in place to direct the development of standards. You want me to?
Past your 5 minutes, if I can
I
get you
am
to
past
wrap
my
up.
5 minutes, but I'm so excited to be here. So to conclude then, we think that establishing this separate track would make sense for Canada. It would improve safety. It would give a tool that you need in order to keep pace with digital technologies. So thank you. I am done.
Thank you. I'm sure we'll get a chance to answer, or you can explain a few other things in the other rounds. Well, I'll go to Ms. Kuzaya, if I'm pronouncing that wrong. Please let me know the correct pronunciation. Please go ahead for 5 minutes, please.
Bonjour.
Hello, and thank you. And you pronounce my name correctly. The Conseil du Patronat du Québec thanks the committee for the opportunity to present its comments as part of its study on the modernization of federal regulations. Legislative and regulatory framework is something that is a key concern for Quebec employers. The CPQ believes that a legislative and regulatory framework that sets too rigid limits on the way companies operate can limit their ability to improve performance and productivity and create wealth. It's a fact that regulations with a laudable objective can often have undesirable consequences that distance us from that objective and can have a negative impact. On the other hand, administrative tasks and the burden of paperwork weigh heavily on the time of managers and business owners, with direct consequences for operations. Delays in obtaining authorizations, for example, for project promoters, duplication, complexity of processes are irritants and disincentives to investment. Streamlined processes and more effective regulation would encourage private investment and improve business productivity and competitiveness, as well as their contribution to prosperity at no cost to the state. It is also worth noting that when you're looking at a bill or a draft regulation, the formalities and their consequences may seem measured, but however, the cumulative effect can be quite a heavy burden for companies. So we have to have an overall view and to consider the accumulation of all these formalities for companies, especially SMEs, and to do everything possible to lighten the burden. We need to look at a focus on regulation, focused regulation on efficiency, results, and predictability. And here are a few recommendations along these lines. First of all, we need to improve the government's approach to regulatory development by ensuring that consultation periods and deadlines are conducive to optimum stakeholder participation and by also involving independent experts. Rigorously analyze, as soon as they are implemented and on an ongoing basis, the real impact on businesses of new regulatory and administrative requirements of legislation passed by the government, and then propose the necessary relief to rapidly reduce the regulatory and administrative burden. Ensure that the impact studies accompanying new legislative or regulatory provisions are based on comments from the sectors involved and the realities on the ground. Provide companies with basic guidelines to facilitate compliance, consistency, and predictability. Of course, harmonize and avoid duplication, both between different departments and agencies and between different levels of government. In this regard, as part of Budget 2023, the federal government said it was prepared to work with the provinces and territories to deepen federal-provincial cooperation to achieve the one project, one evaluation objective, but this has yet to materialize. Ensure that companies do not have to repeat certain requests and formalities when situations are identical or when the company has demonstrated exemplary compliance in the past. Work with the provinces to remove barriers to interprovincial trade, including mutual recognition of standards and harmonization of regulations. Draw inspiration from the Quebec government, which has committed to introducing a specific bill each year to promote regulatory and administrative streamlining, and has adopted an ambitious plan to reduce the regulatory and admin burden on businesses with quantified targets for controlling volume and costs. Ensure compliance with the one-for-one rule and improve it. So under the current rule, regulators must remove a regulation each time they adopt a new one. This rule focuses solely on regulation. However, increasingly, laws, policies, and guidelines are having a significant impact on businesses and citizens as well. Finally, avoid new regulations that are counterproductive and are not based on a proven need. I think, for example, C58 on replacement workers. Perhaps this is outside of the scope of the committee, but we wanted to draw your attention to this. And thank you. And I will be more than happy to answer your questions. And we might be able to provide some examples with regards to temporary foreign workers or the Act to Combat Forced Labor and Child Labor in Supply Chains.
Thanks very much. Unfortunately, our other witnesses haven't been able to log in yet, so we're going to start our opening round. So,
Ms. Furlong just appeared
on
the list.
Ms. Furlong, are you there?
I am. Thank you very much.
Can you turn your camera? Perfect. Just in time. Impeccable timing. If you're ready, we'll go ahead with you for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair and honorable members of the committee, for allowing me to be here today. My name is Shana Furlong. I'm the president and CEO of the Richmond Chamber of Commerce in British Columbia, situated on the traditional territory of the Musqueam Nation. The Richmond Chamber, celebrating its 100th year in 2025, is the longest-standing business organization in our community. As MP Baines will know, Richmond is a tremendously diverse community. It's home to Vancouver International Airport, which brings visitors and newcomers to Canada from around the globe. Richmond's diversity extends beyond demographics to our employers, with over 13,000 businesses employing nearly 130,000 workers. The agri-food sector is significant given that 39% of Richmond's land mass is dedicated to agriculture. Additionally, our proximity to the U.S. border, airport, and Vancouver-Fraser Port Authority make Richmond a major West Coast hub for intermodal transportation and distribution. We also boast an emerging clean tech sector, key local manufacturers, and a significant tourism economy. Today, I'll be highlighting some challenges faced by our employers and suggest potential solutions identified by our chamber network. Regulation and red tape remain a major concern. While we share the goal of making Canada attractive for investment in entrepreneurs, the regulatory burden often acts as a disincentive. In 2006, Canada ranked 4th in the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business report, but fell to 23rd in just 14 years, largely attributed to a challenging regulatory environment. Post-pandemic, national productivity has lagged. Reforming Canada's regulatory framework is crucial to our economic competitiveness. In 2023, the Toronto Stock Exchange saw the record net sell-off of $48.7 billion of Canadian equities, indicating a loss of investor confidence. At the same time, Canadian investment abroad has grown significantly, while foreign direct investment in Canada lags, resulting in a net direct investment position of nearly $811 billion, nearly an order of magnitude greater than 10 years prior. As investment dwindles, so too does our GDP per capita. Real GDP growth was only 1.1% in 2023, the lowest since 2016, with GDP per capita now 2.5% below pre-pandemic levels, equating to a decline of about $4,200 per person. Now, despite these challenges, there is great opportunity within Canada for major projects and emerging industries. The clean energy sector, for example, is crucial. According to the Canadian Climate Institute, achieving net zero will require electricity production to increase by 1.6 to 2.1 times. This necessitates significant growth in generation facilities, transmission infrastructure, and distribution networks, requiring public support and streamlined approvals processes. The federal government's own estimates are that we currently have an investment gap of $115 billion annually in clean tech. Unfortunately, Canada's reputation for enabling that necessary investment is a bit challenged. For instance, the Parkland Corporation recently abandoned plans for a $600 million renewable diesel complex in Burnaby, BC, due to rising project costs, market uncertainty, and the competitive advantage of the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act. The resources sector also faces long timelines and overlapping review processes. However, the 2022 Critical Mineral Strategy, One Project, One Assessment commitment, is promising and could be applied across all major projects. The Western Transportation Advisory Council's 2024 Compass Report highlights the deteriorating business climate. Over half of respondents rated the regulatory environment as poor, with concerns centered on restrictive regulations and long approval processes. One survey respondent to that, representing a railway operator, said, "It's tough to invest in a geography that has unpredictable rules. At any minute, things could change, and it never seems like they change to help business." To address these issues, we need to take decisive, bold steps as a nation. We believe that Canada can absolutely once again attract much private sector investment domestically and from abroad by implementing an economic competitive mandate for all federal regulators. Leveraging new technologies for regulatory design and review with a focus on efficient implementation and identifying areas of regulatory overlap. And we agree that a firm grasp on the one-for-one rule with an eye to reducing time to project approvals is necessary. So Canada's regulatory environment presents some significant challenges to economic prosperity and our global investment reputation, but by adopting a balanced approach to regulation that protects public interests while promoting economic competitiveness, Canada can reverse its declining productivity and investment trends. Thank you so much for your time and your consideration.
Thanks very much. Our final witness, Mr. De Tomisas, is still trying to log in. He won't have a camera, so if he's able to log in, I'll let everyone know it'll be audio only. For that witness, we'll start for 6 minutes with Mrs. Kusi, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Ms. Furlong, the border officers at the CBSA voted last week in favor of strike action due to the lack of a contract for the last 2 years. Their demands include wage parity, protection from management retaliation, access to telework, and protections from CBSA's obsessive reliance on contracting out. How concerned are you and the businesses that you represent that this border disruption will cause a massive impact on Canadian business?
Thank you so much for the question. It's much appreciated. While I cannot comment on the specific labor negotiations of this union, we saw the huge impact our West Coast port strikes had to the economy as a whole last year. It was measured in the billions of dollars. CBSA is absolutely critical to the movement of goods and people across the border and into our ports. It is unfathomable that we would see another shutdown within a short period of time. And I think this committee knows how critical it is that Canada regain its reputation as a reliable trading partner.
Very well said. My next question was going to be, what would be the impact on Canada's economy if this was to occur? You did mention about the previous incident, the damage being in the billions. Would you like to make any further comment as to the impact on Canada's economy were this to occur?
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, I don't have an estimate right now as to the full impact on the economy. I would be happy to do some research and provide that following the meeting.
That would be very much appreciated, Ms. Furlong. Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, one doesn't have to look deeply into recent headlines to see that Canada's economic conditions are declining and consequently eroding the prosperity and living standards of Canadians. Between 2009 and 2018, the number of regulations in Canada grew from 66,000 to 72,000. These regulations, of course, restrict business activity, impose costs on firms, and reduce economic productivity. According to a recent red tape study published by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, the cost of regulation from all three levels of government to Canadian businesses totaled $38.8 billion in 2020 for a total of 731 million hours, the equivalent of nearly 375,000 full-time jobs. If we apply a $16.65 per hour cost, the federal minimum wage in Canada for 2023, $12.2 billion annually is lost to regulatory compliance. And of course, as our witnesses know here today, Canada's smallest businesses bear a proportionately high burden of the cost, paying up to 5 times more for regulatory compliance per employee than larger businesses. The smallest businesses pay $7,223 per employee annually to comply with government regulation, while larger businesses pay a much lower $1,237 per employee for regulatory compliance. Certainly not small numbers, Mr. Chair. So, Monsieur Girard, although federal departments and agencies are meant to annually report the regulatory burden they impose on Canadians, this is not legislated and is extremely difficult to access. Why do you think the government is trying to hide this information from Canadians, unlike many of its other provincial counterparts?
Well, I'm not. I think I'm not able to answer that question directly in terms of the regulatory costs. I think there is a need to understand a lot better how we frame compliance, both through standards and regulations, and what are the impacts of creating new regulations. And I don't see a lot of reports on outcomes. That would be my interest, is figuring out what are the what are the expectations we have in terms of laws when we pass new laws, and how do we measure whether we're getting there. I'm not seeing that, unfortunately. So we're focusing on the process. We're not really focusing on the outcomes.
Right. The federal government has a one-for-one rule building its regulatory framework, which means for every new regulatory cost, as outlined by another witness, it must be offset by an equal or greater reduction. Has this government been following through on this commitment, would you say?
Well, given what you just mentioned before, I'm assuming no. And I think that the track that I'm proposing in the paper would help reduce the regulatory burden. If we took a hard look at compliance to laws through standards as opposed to regulations, and standards are co-designed by industry and academics and regulators, you'd probably be able to find a way to reduce the regulatory burden while keeping Canadians safe. That would be my sense. That taking a look at standards as opposed to full-fledged regulations would keep Canadians safe, but would reduce the burden on industry.
Correct. Because as I mentioned, the cost of regulation, according to the CFIB, was $38.8 billion in 2020 and took a total of $731 million. Can you comment further on how much of Canada's business would be improved by removing the billions in dollars of costs in regulation?
Actually, I have to interrupt because that is our time. Perhaps
Thank you.
we can save
Thank
it
you very
for
much, Monsieur Girard. Thank you,
response when
President.
Conservatives up next. Mr. Baines, over to you, sir, please.
Mr. Chair, and thank you to Monsieur Girard for being here, and of course all of our other witnesses online. My first question will be directed to the Richmond Chamber of Commerce. Surprise, surprise. And thank you, Ms. Furlong, for joining us today, of course, online from Richmond, BC. I know you explained in considerably how much impact the different types of businesses we have in Richmond, land, sea, air. It's a major hub. We have a lot of technology there, and even the moon. I know we have a company that's put the camera on the rover on the moon. So let's just add space to that as well. And I know that the Chamber does a lot of hard work on producing reports, conducting studies, and providing feedback. So that is a primary piece of what we try to look for in this committee, looking for recommendations. Last year, one of your policies, or many of your policies, were adopted by the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Could you briefly summarize for the committee what these policies were?
I'd be happy to share that. Thank you so much. So we had two policies that went forward to the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and a third that we were supporting. The third I'll speak about first. It was focused on Canadian-made supply of sustainable aviation fuel. We often find that in Canada, our sustainable aviation fuel is refined abroad, and it is shipped to North America, often at great expense, which actually calls into question how sustainable it is. When we're refining in Singapore and fueling in Los Angeles, it really challenges Canadian airlines in their green technology and in their future sustainability plans. Another policy we brought forward was calling for federal adoption of a permanent transit fund for municipalities across Canada. That is something that MP Baines, you will know, has been championed very hard by Metro Vancouver's Mayor's Council, and we're firmly in agreement there. Workers need to be able to get to their places of employment, and people need to be able to move around the regions. And the third policy we brought forward was seeking greater support for port infrastructure and project approval timelines across the country. In our backyard, we've seen the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority's Robert Bank Terminal 2 project take over a decade for its environmental approval. And now they are currently in the process of working with Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Because the expansion of port capacity at Roberts Bank Terminal 2 is so critical to the businesses, not only in our region in British Columbia, but across the country, we believe that moving more quickly on significant projects like this will not only help control costs for Canadian consumers, taxpayers, and businesses, but also help us create great jobs more quickly and at the time we need them.
Okay, and staying with the ports, I had the opportunity to participate in some of the digital technologies that were announced with respect to seamless communication by large commercial shipping companies and logistics at the Vancouver Ports terminals. Why is that important? Can you maybe explain how would this improve the port activity and what role the provinces and territories would have in this?
Thank you so much. I have to say I am absolutely not an expert on this subject, but I believe I've seen some of the same presentations you have. What we are seeing with the ports is that we need to move more goods more quickly. We are seeing products reaching Canada just-in-time deadlines, and those products need to move through our logistics companies into the market very, very quickly. The use of digital technology to manage the workforce, manage transportation on the ground, and at freight is absolutely critical. And I'm very excited to see what's coming forward. And I'm sorry I don't have more information for you.
That's totally fine. I'm gonna ask a little bit more about. You will recall, like years ago, provincial government. While I was working there, we actually had a ministry dedicated to deregulation, and with over 80,000 different regulations were removed and changed. Is there a risk with that associated? Because we did see, for example, a real estate industry in British Columbia that went unregulated for years. We had issues where the homes were being flipped, contracts of homes were being flipped month after month, adding $50,000 value to each contract before it was actually closed, the sales were closed. So maybe talk a little bit about risks associated with deregulation.
Thank you. I think we would all agree that a perfect regulatory environment is going to balance the public good, public safety, with the interests of business and our broader economy. I'll give you one example. The way we regulate sunscreen in Canada. If you go to the United States, you can pick up a bottle of sunscreen for much less money, and there's more options. Here in Canada, we regulate sunscreen as a drug or a natural health product, and companies spend quite a bit of money jumping through many hoops with Health Canada to get approval in Canada. So when you go into a Canadian drugstore or to a Canadian cosmetics company, you're going to see many fewer options, and those options are going to be significantly more expensive. Now, that's just a very small segment of the economy, but I think we can see it across all industries. When we have a regulatory burden that, yes, is protecting the individual or broader social good, is it balanced with other jurisdictions? Because we have to remember we are not an island. We are competing with other jurisdictions across the globe for investment and project approval, but also general public interest.
Thank you very much. Before we go to Mrs. Vignola, Mr. Tomasis has managed to come online. If it's okay with everyone, we'll go through Mrs. Vignola, then Mr. Backrack, then we'll allow the witness to do a 5-minute opening before we start again. Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Mrs. Vignola, go ahead, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the witnesses for being here today. And thank you to my colleagues. When we talk about modernization, and I would like to speak with Mr. Girard to start with. When we talk about modernization of federal regulations, I understand that we're trying to simplify or streamline, but it doesn't mean that we are less responsible, that things are less safe, and there seems to be a certain resistance to change. And I have 2 questions. Here's my first. Modernization of regulations and tools would have what would be the advantages for civil servants who use these tools? And my second question, how can we change an organizational culture? Thank you, Mrs. Vignola. With regards to the first question, if we would set out a new way for regulatory authorities to develop new ways for businesses to comply with the laws. If we want to do this with standardization, there's a new tool that can be used and that they don't have right now, and so it would be possible to facilitate the creation of technical committees with industry, with academics, with all stakeholders that are involved to reach a consensus in a credible process. So this opens doors to regulatory authorities, to civil servants to find win-win situations, win-win solutions. Secondly, by using standards, a standard has to be reviewed every 5 years. So it's not static, it's something dynamic. This allows the regulatory authorities to continue the conversation, to continue a dialogue with stakeholders, and to raise the bar when we find that there are problems. And so this is how the system works. And the regulatory authorities participate in standardization for 100 years now. So it's nothing new. But in new sectors or emergent sectors, such as high tech, this is new. So we're giving them a chance. They're being given an opportunity to open the door and to have discussions, to have requirements that we can review and that we can certify. With regards to culture change, as member of the committee, it's important for you to look over this because there is a resistance to change. There is a resistance on behalf of civil servants, and perhaps that's justified. But we fear risk. We fear new approaches because we don't want negative consequences if a mistake is made. So education around this, what I would suggest is to help regulatory authorities to understand how the system works and to give them the permission, open and explicit permission to use the system rather than hiding behind the tried and true solutions that have been used for almost 150 years now with traditional processes for regulatory measures. So here in Canada, we have no opportunity to have AI regulations until 2028, and so that doesn't make any sense. If we had a standard system, if we had requests for AI, we would be able to have standards that could be applied within a year. A year is not great, but it's better than 2028. So we can innovate and we can change the culture, but I think that you should definitely study this. Thank you, Mr. Girard. My next question is once again for yourself, but also for Mrs. Kozaya. The lowering of productivity in a country, is this being led by regulation? I have a few basic economics classes, and in my memory, the increase or reduction of productivity has is for multiple causes. The economic theories, as we teach in our high schools, have things changed? If not, what are the other factors that have an influence on productivity of a country, and which ones are currently having an impact on productivity in Quebec and Canada? I'll give the floor to the Quebec Employers Council, but what I can tell you is that if there's no regulatory alignment between different jurisdictions, this does create problems for the industry. The industry then has to develop and certify 2 or 3, 4 times throughout the country for a market of 40 million people. So this can reduce productivity. But of course, regulatory alignment is important. However, if we have regulations, it's protect people. If we have people who are killed by electrical systems that are malfunctioning, we're going to see an increase in costs elsewhere. So we have to use a balanced approach. Regulation doesn't necessarily mean that productivity will go down. We really have to focus and examine things, what's important, not just make sweeping statements such as that. Thank you. So it's not the only aspect, in your opinion. It's one, but not the only one. Mrs. Kozaya, thank you for the question. It's not the only factor. Productivity is linked to many different things, everything linked to training, education, human capital, and a better trained workplace that's able to adapt. We can say that our productivity will increase due to this. There are fiscal measures that are important. We have to invest in capital, and also there's a predictability linked to capital and investment. The regulatory environment is one of the issues, but there's all kinds of infrastructure also. We spoke about transportation and other types of infrastructure, so there are many factors, but governments can have an impact on regulatory issues. without it being a huge cost. It's not to provide a tax break. We want to have results. And I think it's important to work ahead of the curve with businesses to determine and decide that there will be no undesirable effects that have an impact on productivity.
Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to our witnesses. Mr. Girard, I found your presentation interesting when it comes to the use of standards versus regulations. And I think when you were finishing up your statement, you were talking about the experience in other countries and how they've established standards in perhaps a more fulsome way. Could you just complete that thought and share with the committee what other countries are doing that we should look to?
Okay. Thank you very much for that question. It's a very good question. The title of the paper is, we need to establish a new approach, and new approach is in quotation mark. That's a reference to the EU approach. So since 1985, the European Commission has the authority to make standardization requests to its standards body. I was just out of university in 1985. Some of you were still in high school, I'm sure, or primary school, perhaps some of you. So it's been a long time. So if you think the example of AI, you know that in Europe there was a law regarding high-risk AI applications. It was passed in March. Well, in December of last year, the European Commission asked its standard body to develop 10 standards to frame compliance to its new legislation, its upcoming legislation. So from data collection to ensuring that privacy requirements are met, documentation, conformity assessment, it's all there. So the European Union has a mechanism to mandate the development of standards. And the other thing, too, about that is once the standard is out, there is a presumption of conformity. So once the standard is out, the regulators have helped design that standard. When it's published, it becomes part of the legislative tool. It is, industry has to comply with it. In the US, you have executive orders from the White House. So the White House regularly asks its National Institute on Standards and Technology, NIST, to develop standards so that products and systems are safer. They've done it for smart grid. They're doing it for AI now. In the UK, they've designed a Standards Institute for AI, and they approve standards in a list of recognized standards. They don't even need a regulation. You can put them on a website, and people know they have to comply to these standards. Long answer to your question.
Yeah. Interesting stuff. I'll try to fit in one more question. It's a very interesting distinction between standards and regulation, and it seems one of the key distinctions in my mind is that the standards agencies are entirely arm's length from lawmakers, from the government. And so I guess the question is around the trade-off when it comes to accountability. So, you've mentioned the application when it comes to AI. The other safety regulation and legislation that we're currently debating is the Online Harms Act, which speaks very much to safety. But it seems like if we were to empower an arm's length standards body to come up with standards for online harm, they're going to be making a lot of very subjective, like already in the legislation, there are serious questions about definitions, about concepts, about society's expectations around online safety. We would now be talking about empowering an unaccountable body to make these determinations. Are there limits to what standards bodies should be empowered with?
Excellent question again. So when you develop a standard, you have a technical committee, and it has to have a balanced matrix of interests, including regulators. So first thing is regulators are at the table. Regulators influence the process. Regulators vote. If regulators as a block say, we don't like this standard, it doesn't meet our requirements, it's not going to help you comply with our legislation, it's not going to go anywhere. So regulators have a really important role to play in designing standards, especially when they're mandatory, when you know it's going to become part of the law. So that's one thing. The other thing is, if you have a standard internationally that you think would work, you can bring it to Canada, review it, and adapt it. If you think that some features are not strong enough, you can make deviations to it and then come up with something that works for you. So this issue is, it's a new tool you have in your toolbox. You're at the table, you make the decisions with industry, with academics, with experts, but you have the last word when it comes to the actual content of the document that you'll adopt.
But like, riddle me this, it sounds an awful lot like the process for creating regulations. Like, where's the distinction?
The distinction is in the way that the standard system works. It has the right checks and balances. It forces people to make decisions, thinking through the issues. And when it comes to digital governance, our Digital Standards Institute in Canada can develop a standard within a year. So that's a big difference between what we're doing on the standard front and what is being done with regulations.
I think I could probably dig deeper on that topic because I find the difference somewhat nuanced. But I'll ask just about, we've heard a lot about this idea of add one regulation, take one regulation away. And it seems to me that this is an oversimplification of the challenge that we're faced with. Not every regulation is created equal. Some are very complex, some are very simple. Should we be not focused more on the efficiency of the regulatory process rather than the number of regulations?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure that this one-to-one, applied generically will work for you. But what I know is that, when you think about standards in federal, provincial, and territorial regulations, close to 10,000 of them, we know they're useful, and we know that they're dynamic and flexible, and we know that the tangible world we live in, the tangible products you use every day, it's not regulated, it's standardized, and it's safe. So there's got to be a way for us to think about this in terms of, do we really need a regulation for this? Or can we afford to take a standard approach and achieve the same results? And then you look at the outcomes. And if it works, then you save Canadians a lot of money and a lot of time. Thank you.
Thanks. We're now going to go to Mr. De Tomasis for your opening statement. Are you there, sir? We understand your camera's not working, but your mic is.
Microphone should be working, yes. My apologies on the technical difficulties with my camera.
That's okay. Go ahead. You've got 6 minutes. Go ahead, sir. Or 5 minutes. Sorry, I apologize. Go ahead, sir.
No problem. Well, good morning. I wanted to thank everyone for allowing me the opportunity to speak. And what I'm here to speak today about is some of the challenges that we're encountering at our deepwater port in the Port of Windsor. Moreterm Limited is located in Windsor. It's located a stone's throw from North America's busiest international border with the U.S. Some of the challenges that we're facing is with movement of goods back and forth from Canada into the U.S. and then back from the U.S. into Canada. Customers would like to simplify the regulatory process by cutting the unnecessary red tape to make cross-border trade easier. We have identified challenges with moving product across borders once the shipments arrive at our warehouse and at the Port of Windsor. More-term customers would like the option of shipping product not only by truckload, but by cargo, by the entire cargo that arrives at our terminal. Much of the product that we handle at Moreterm is steel, aluminum, steel plate, project cargo, those types of commodities, which could be moved by one lot as opposed to individual truckloads, which creates a lot of red tape and administrative work for the customers and Moreterm. If we could propose a few solutions to help streamline the process, they would include, a trusted carrier, fast pass type of solution that is similar to what the auto carriers and other OEMs use in North America. Another solution could be the development of a free trade zone in the Windsor area, where customers could land product or commodities in Windsor for further shipment into the U.S. Currently, Moreterm does have a bonded area in one of our warehouses, and customers do take advantage of this for convenience to move products back and forth, but the area is limited and it's fairly small. I also would like to talk about another possible solution, and this is a sufferance warehouse. We are continually being asked by customers in Europe and in the US about moving product into the Windsor area or Canada and landing it in a sufferance warehouse where product could be stored, and then product could be moved in and out of the sufferance warehouse under one bond or limited paperwork. There is a real need for sufferance warehouse in our location. We believe it's a strategic location in North America where products could move to and fro very easily and very quickly. We are a multimodal facility with rail connections to CP, KC, and CN, and then we also have a direct connection to CSX in the US. So customers are eagerly looking at bringing cargo into Windsor because of the connections to the 400 series highways, North American highways, and rail shipments. So we would love to be able to continue these discussions and look at some solutions that would make sense for more term and for Canada.
Great. Thank you very much. We'll now go to Mrs. Block for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I echo my colleagues' comments in welcoming you all here today, albeit by Zoom for many of you, but Mr. Girard, welcome to the room. My first question will be for Ms. Furlong. Firstly, congratulations on almost reaching 100 years, and I'm sure you're busy preparing for that celebration. In a previous meeting, we heard from witnesses that the carbon tax rebate in the amount of $2.5 billion has been withheld from the current government from small and medium-sized businesses across Canada. Now, in the budget 2024, they've indicated that they plan to finally return the money to these small businesses, and I'll quote what the budget actually says. Budget 2024 proposes to urgently return fuel charge proceeds from 2019-20 through 2023-24 to an estimated 600,000 businesses with 499 or fewer employees. I'm wondering if you could comment on the impact or any feedback that you've received on the impact of the carbon tax, and whether or not your members are aware of this newfound urgency to return this money to them and the process for doing so.
Thank you for the question, Mrs. Block. The carbon tax works a little bit differently in British Columbia than it does in other provinces in Canada. So I would be very happy to reach out to my colleagues at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and share their perspectives on the way this is affecting businesses in those provinces. But unfortunately, I can't provide much input to that question.
Okay. Thank you. Have you heard from any of your members in regards to a process for having that returned, or are you telling me that because of this difference with British Columbia, they would not be receiving any kind of a rebate?
The carbon tax is administered provincially in British Columbia, so we would not be under the same federal regime for rebates.
Okay, thank you very much. For both you and Mr. DeThomasis, I am wondering if you are at all aware that Minister Anand, as President of the Treasury Board, is required to publish an annual report on federal regulatory management initiatives under the Red Tape Reduction Act. And this was an act that was introduced by the previous Conservative government back in 2012. Are you aware of this report? Have you or any of your members or customers had an opportunity to review this report? And I'll pass it over to Ms. Furlong first, and then Mr. DeThomasis.
Thank you so much. I have not read this report. I am aware of its requirements, but no, I have not seen it myself.
Yes, I haven't had a chance to review it. I was aware that there is a report, but I have not had a chance to review it in detail.
Okay, thank you very much. The current government tends to introduce either deeply flawed or deliberately vague proposed legislation, leaving the details to the bureaucrats through regulation. And I'm wondering if you've given any thought to the kind of advice that you would provide to the next government, who will most likely be a conservative government, what you would like to see implemented in the first 100 days following the next election.
Sorry, was that question directed to me?
To any one of you that would like to provide any advice on regulatory changes that need to be made.
Thank you, Mrs. Block. Well, I will jump in first. Regardless of the next government that is formed, and the Richmond Chamber of Commerce, like all chambers of commerce, is strictly nonpartisan. But we believe very strongly that introducing economic competitiveness mandates across all federal regulators would be an absolutely fantastic first step in ensuring that economic competitiveness is measured across regulators and they are accountable to it.
Thanks. That is our time. Mr. Kuzmierczak, please.
Much, Mr. Chair, and just wanted to ask Ms. Furlong a quick question. Recently in the National Post, the leader of the Conservative opposition wrote an opinion piece in which he stated, quote, "At the most, the Chamber of Commerce, Business Council, and Canadian Federation of Independent Business hold pointless luncheons and meetings and write op-eds or record interviews that almost no one sees. As a leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, I refuse to meet the aforementioned groups." I wanted to ask you, Ms. Furlong, what is your take, response to that, hearing that comment, especially knowing that consultation and discussion are critical to making sure that we future-proof our regulations in Canada here?
Thank you so much for the question. Unfortunately, I haven't read that piece in the National Post, so thank you. I would disagree very strongly. I think chambers of commerce across Canada are the grassroots nonprofit organizations that serve the widest sector of business groups and employers across our communities. I work with everyone from small solopreneurs, nonprofit social service agencies, to major companies like MDA, which MP Baines referenced earlier. I think the chamber network is absolutely critical for providing the voice for business across British Columbia, and we're able to do that because we're nonpartisan to any government that is formed. And I would hope that the leader will reverse his opinion if they do form office. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Furlong, and I wholeheartedly agree. Listening to small business and supporting small business is absolutely critical because we know small businesses are the engines of our economy here in Canada. So thank you so much for your response. Mr. De Tomasis, I wanted to say I had the opportunity last year to join you at More Term to announce over $12.5 million in federal funding from the National Trade Corridor Fund to More Term and ETR. And this is part and parcel of investments that we're making, that this Liberal government is making in our ports. Just last week, we learned that the Canada Infrastructure Bank is investing in part of a $750 million expansion of the Port of Prince Rupert. And so this is what this Liberal government is doing, investing in ports because we know that it is so important and it's so vital and critical. I just wanted to ask you to get on record, how important is that investment that we made last year to More Term? How important is that to the operations in Windsor?
Well, thank you, Mr. Kuzmierczak. It's vitally important. As you know, infrastructure is key to the movement of goods. It's key to economic development and competitiveness in our space. Many of our assets at More Term Limited were beyond 60 years. Their useful life was at the very end, and without the federal assistance, I don't think we would have been able to replace the warehousing, the shore walls that need major repair and reinvestment. With that reinvestment, we were able to develop a new warehouse. We're going to be developing another warehouse to support trade and to support transloading and taking trucks off the roading and moving it through a green initiative, which is by rail, which is the most green next to marine. This is why I'm speaking today, is because our customers are asking for further abilities to move commodities through our port into final destinations. With those requests come some streamlining of, I'm going to call it, older regulations, older administrative functions that's required to move these commodities. So that's where we're willing and able here to work with the federal government and the province to look at ways where we can be innovative in the way we can move commodities into the U.S., into Mexico, to ensure that we're competitive in this space.
Thank you very much, Mr. De Tomasis. And listening to our ports, listening to companies like yours, businesses like yours, is so critical. And so this year, we met together with Minister Mary Ng, Minister of International Trade, and also Ambassador Hellman at Moorterm to see the great work that's being done there, the amazing workers there. You had mentioned some of the regulatory irritants that you think could be fixed or addressed. Do you have an example of some of those small administrative hurdles that can eliminating those hurdles can create sort of big positive impact? Can you talk a little bit about those?
I'm afraid one of those hurdles is a 5-minute session is up. Perhaps you can get back to it next round, or perhaps Mr. De Thomas, you can provide that in writing to us. We'll go to Mrs. Vignola for 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question for this round, Mr. Girard and the others could complete with the remaining time. We spoke about AI earlier. I've been to some meetings where we were being told that the large businesses working in AI are very competitive, but they're asking for regulation. And here's my question. If we regulate before legislating, are we working in a less democratic fashion and doing things in the incorrect order? A regulation is not voted on, but an act is. So we should legislate and then regulate, or is it okay to regulate without legislating? I think that we need to set out the main principles first, and this goes through legislation. And a law will tell you what has to be done, what shouldn't be done in order to reduce risks, and that's the what. But the how is regulation. And so what I'm suggesting as an alternative is that given that technology is rapidly evolving and given that we're always in reactionary mode, we're reacting to new technology, I'm proposing an approach where regulatory authorities could decide to create a standard. This takes about a year. It can be modified, and then you can see the results. You can see the results of the work. And once the technologies have matured, then you can regulate. So it could be an approach that allows us to react quickly to make sure that an act will be in compliance without having an impact on innovation. So it's sort of a way to strike a balance. So we need to set a threshold, and this was reasonable for everyone. Thank you. Mrs. Kozaya.
Oui, et il me semble effectivement.
Yes, I'm not a specialist, but to have an overall legislation with standards and regulation, yes, would be a good idea.
Thank you, Mrs. Vignola. Mr. Backrack, and then Mr. Abultaif.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll ask Mr. Girard a question about regulatory capture and how to avoid it in the setting of standards. One of the criticisms we hear, and we've had these conversations recently with members of the labor community, is that regulations get drawn up in close consultation with what government sees as being the key stakeholders, which is often the industry that is being regulated. And the reason they see them as being the key stakeholders is because there's an entire industry around lobbying government, as anyone who works on the Hill knows. And often the public, which are the beneficiaries of regulation, are left out of that initial conversation. Unions often feel the same, and so they're brought in to consult on something that's essentially been written without them. How do we avoid that, both in the regulatory process and in the standards process you were talking about?
So it's about openness and transparency. Clearly, you have to be open, you have to be transparent before you start, as you're doing it, and after you're done. If I can give you the standards track, I know that committees have to be balanced. You can't have industry that takes all the seats. Industry has, a quorum, and then consumers and academics and experts are also there, and they have a voice and they have a vote. Every time there's a comment being made, it has to be disposed of with everybody around the table agreeing. So I think that those kind of rules, when it comes to openness and transparency, work well. I prefer an open and transparent process where everything has been basically looked at than basically a black box.
And would you say that currently differs between the standard setting process, which is done by a committee with balanced representation, and the regulatory process, which is led by government and government chooses with whom they consult, et cetera?
I don't know. There was a mention about 66 to 77,000 regulations. It must be quite different, depending on the jurisdiction or the ministry or the department. But openness and transparency, I mean, you could design an approach where it becomes the norm. I know in my process for digital standards, everybody can become a member of a committee. So you're not excluded, and everybody can take a look at everything that's being drafted. So to me, that's kind of the ultimate.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Mr. Bultafe, welcome back to OGGO. It's been a few years. Go ahead, sir, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Super Chair. Thank you. Thanks for the witnesses. I'll delve to the questions quickly. Mr. Furlong, you mentioned that investments to outside Canada, from Canada, is higher or going up, while investment inside or into Canada is going down. That tells me, as a former businessman, that there's an issue of productivity and there's an issue of regulations. Are we overregulated?
Great question. I think the business answer to that would be yes, we are. Looking at the numbers at the end of 2023, Canadian investment abroad had grown to $2,171.3 billion, while foreign direct investment in Canada was about $1,360.3 billion. So that net direct investment position of $811 billion is absolutely concerning. There's a very good graph that shows the growth in that net direct investment position over the past 15 years. And really, we are seeing that exponential growth of money not being invested in Canada and foreign direct investment leaving Canada.
Do you think that regulations are done at the government level solely, with a lack of consultation with the stakeholders and the businesses and the main people doing the business, or not? And what can we do? Because we do have a problem, we know that, and we're looking for solutions. Can you suggest something in this regard? And can you tell us if there's a lack of consultation with the main stakeholders?
So I don't think it's the case that it's being done necessarily with a lack of consultation. I think there are many very well-meaning people looking at problems that are facing people and industries across many different aspects of regulation. Unfortunately, I think we are not reviewing our regulation frequently enough, and we are not measuring how regulation is affecting our economic competitiveness. So when I spoke before, I said, let's introduce an economic competitiveness mandate across all regulators. Well, right now, we're not accountable to economic competitiveness. As the impact of regulation. We're not measuring it, so it's not something that we're focusing on in all regulators.
Okay.
We would really like to see that.
Two G7 countries, Germany and US, I'll take as examples. We are way behind these two countries as far as productivity. And if anyone to look, I mean, if any side to look at to learn, it should be these two countries. Are we doing enough to look outside the box and trying to fix our problems or not?
I think that's a great point and a great question. We have seen very novel regulatory tools to mobilize the private sector in financing, for instance, massive construction of clean energy facilities. In particular, in Germany, they've provided an example of how feed-in tariffs can help accelerate the build-out of wind and solar facilities. These are all things we should be looking at.
Mr. De Tomasis, you've presented three solutions. One of them is to start up a free trade zone in Windsor. This is an amazing idea. I know Dubai did it 20, 30 years back. What are you doing to convince the government to be that creative?
Well, it goes back to what you were saying about competitiveness. In order to stay competitive in a changing world with a lot of the reshoring efforts that are happening, moving product back to North America, we need to look at new innovative ways to become more compatible with our biggest trading partner, which is the US and also Mexico. Infrastructure is key to moving that product. At Moreterm in Windsor, we do have the connectivity with railways and highways. We're soon to be launching the new Gordie Howe International Bridge. That'll help to expedite movement of goods. I think right now we're lagging in the administrative side where it's the paperwork and the movement of paperwork and clearing commodities across the borders to allow this trade to happen.
You also mentioned that on proposing for bonded warehouse, or you call it sufferance warehouse, that was a demand by U.S. and European clients. Can you talk about this a little bit more, please?
In about
Sure,
15 seconds, I'm afraid.
Seconds, yeah. Okay. Sufferance warehouse allows shippers to move product into Canada under one bond. And what that does is allows you to store product in a warehouse, and you can trade the commodities without the movement of those goods, and they remain in that warehouse. It allows for faster, quicker, more efficient trade of commodities.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll go over to you, Mrs. Atwin, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. Joining from Fredericton, New Brunswick. I'm just going to follow up on that last line of questioning and go to Mr. De Thomas. And are there any drawbacks or risks to a potential free trade zone?
From our perspective, I think it encourages trade. Positioned at the busiest international crossing in North America, I think it makes a lot of sense to have a free trade zone in our area. With the investments that the federal government's made in Windsor, totaling almost $36 million for warehousing and new shore wall for the movement of goods from Europe into the North American continent. I think it's a great designation for Windsor to have to exemplify that trade route across the Detroit River by rail, by truck, or by water. As far as a negative drawback or negative consequence, I don't see much in the way of negativities if developed under the proper regulations and the proper structure. I think there's a lot of benefits, including job creation, streamlining of trade, movement of commodities, that helps both countries.
Great, thank you very much. And Mr. Girard, so we noticed in the 2024 budget, it mentioned the words regulatory sandboxes. So I was wondering if you can just explain that to the folks at home and to myself, and perhaps, your opinion on this. Were you pleased to see that? Is it a useful tool? Is it a step in the right direction?
Yes, thank you. Good question. It absolutely is, in my opinion, a step in the right direction because you allow then a conversation to take place between regulators and those impacted by future regulations. And you allow them to play and try new things. So I think that's great. The only recommendation I would make is to, in terms of the wording, I've seen a couple of papers from Treasury Board on regulatory sandboxes, and they seem to insist on being able to do this before new technologies are commercialized. And I think we need to be realistic. We're takers when it comes to technology. So, if there is a new technology that's being deployed, a new social media, a new platform, a new generative AI, well, why not we use the regulatory sandboxes after it's commercialized and trying to adapt it or make some changes to it before it's too late. So, yeah, it's a good idea, but let's use it after products are commercialized because we have no control over that.
And have you met at all with Minister Anand since she became the Treasury Board president?
A couple of times.
Okay. Can you share with us any of the ideas or topics that you were may have been raised during those conversations?
Well, Minister Anand is very interested in this concept of standards. I think she's interested in this idea of incorporation by reference, having standards incorporated by reference in regulations. She thinks it's a good idea. I think she's looking at, innovative ideas with interest. So I'll leave it at that.
And just with regards to the incorporation by reference, so it is in fact used by some departments today. And which ones do you see as perhaps leading the way, or those that might be lagging behind?
So in the paper, I have a list of some of the regulations where standards are incorporated by reference. Some departments will take the as amended from time to time method, which allows new standards to be accepted as is when they're being published. So you don't need to go back and redraft your regulation every time. So that's a good thing. There are some departments here who are, taking a step further. So for example, Health Canada with medical devices, they have a regulation on this, but they also have a list on their website of recognized standards that allow compliance to the medical devices regulation, which means that you don't need to change your regulation every time a new hip replacement part comes up in the marketplace. You just need to add the new standard to the list. I think that's a great way of doing things. It would make life simpler for industry. It would make life simpler for regulators as well. It does not impact accountability, in my opinion.
So we know that some stakeholders are worried about incorporation by reference. They see it perhaps as not the most democratic way to oversee regulations, perhaps maybe giving too much power to government bureaucracy. What do you make of that assessment?
Completely disagree with that. I was at the Standards Council of Canada for 9 years. I was VP there of policy. I engaged with every single department and agency in Ottawa, also the provinces. And regulators that are using standards are participating in standards development. There's no regulatory capture or industry capture. As a matter of fact, I think the biggest problem we have is that we don't know enough about it. Standards are invisible, and that's the biggest problem that we're facing. We need to raise awareness about the merits of standardization in this country. Sorry, I'm taking too long.
It's okay. Thanks, Mr. Girard. Mrs. Cusi, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. De Thomasis, I'll ask the same question of you that I had asked another witness relative to the CBSA, the board officers, at the CBSA voting last week in favor of strike action due to the lack of a contract for the last 2 years. How concerned are you that this this border disruption will cause a massive impact on Canadian businesses? You had mentioned moving commodities into Mexico. I note the extent of your short track is within Canadian borders, but it does mention, I should say, a review of your railway does mention several interchanges where there would be commodities certainly from the U.S. and, as you indicated, going into Mexico. So I'm wondering what the potential impact of a strike at CBSA would be on your railway company, please.
Okay, thank you. It would have significant impacts. One part of our business is the movement of finished vehicles from Windsor into the U.S. and other markets, as well as importing the vehicles from the U.S. into Canada for further shipment. into Canada. We do all of those movements by rail. So any strike or interruption at the border would pose significant threats to that business. We also do move smaller volumes of steel, different commodities into the US, and it would significantly impact that business as well.
Right, thank you. Not surprising. My colleague had questioned the Richmond Chamber of Commerce relative to the carbon tax. We now understand, of course, that the regulations or the administration of the carbon tax is different in British Columbia. But I thought I would also follow through on this question with you, Mr. De Thomasis. What effect does the carbon tax have on the operation of your railway company, please?
Well, it does have an impact on our railway. I don't know, what those, if it's a significant impact or not. But I could provide a response to that question. As right now, I'm not prepared to answer that. I don't have the information in front of me.
Okay, thank you for that. Going back to you, Monsieur Girard, I wanted to talk about the regulatory burdens of the CRA with you. They currently do not require any cutbacks to their regulatory burdens, despite being the most significant burden to small businesses in Canada. Given your specialty in standardization, in your opinion, what regulation should the CRA focus on cutting to reduce their negative impacts on Canadian small business? Would you have any comments relative to the CRA?
I am sorry. It's in my world, it's about tangible products or intangible products. Here we're talking about fiscal, applying fiscal policy. So I would not have any advice or recommendations to make on that front. I apologize. Okay,
thank you. We recently saw the passing of standardizations within Bill S6. Our understanding, or my understanding, I should say, as Shadow Minister for the Treasury Board, is that this was going to be an annual occurrence, an evaluation of standardizations, with S6 having been the most recent iteration after the pandemic. And of course, the first 3 or 4 iterations, I believe, focusing on the low-hanging fruit. In your opinion, is the government keeping to their commitment on S6 and beyond in completing the review of standardizations and the further implementation of broader consultation as the regulation of standardizations for efficiencies continues?
Well, I think they're going in the right direction. Obviously, if there were more resources, it would probably be able to do it in a more expeditious manner. I think that what I'm seeing is that there are more and more standards added to regulations, whether it's at the federal level, provincial level, or territorial level. So that problem, reviewing standards in regulation will become bigger as you review your regulations going forward. So we've got to do something about this. Sorry, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
I apologize. It's getting into a habit of cutting you off, Mr. Girard. I do apologize. Mr. Sousa, go ahead, please. And then in 5 minutes, we'll cut off Mr. Girard again.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think all of us are here today talking about trying to improve the competitiveness of a regulatory system, improve the competitiveness of Canada versus other parts of the world and other jurisdictions, lessen the cumulative burden of regulation. Brian, that old adage, ask for forgiveness, then permission, that's happening right now with AI and a lot of new venture, and the notion of sandboxes try to permit the use of different sources before securities commissions and others take on regulatory matters relative to those issues. And I look at 2008 financial crisis, and had it not been for some of the regulatory impediments, if we call it that had been established in Canada, we wouldn't have weathered that tremendous world situation where Canada was somewhat protected, certainly in the banking sector and hence in our business sector, to the extent that we were able to recover that much more quickly in the manufacturing, certainly in real estate. I appreciate your discussions around voluntary standards versus government regulations. I appreciate the notion of us to relieve regulatory authorities, permit more and simplified methods of accelerating some of the work we do. It reduces regulation, promotes uniformity in some of those standards, it improves responsiveness, and it encourages those very industries to participate in the establishment of those standards, thereby avoiding duplication, hopefully, as we go forward. And all with the sense and the notion of facilitating and promoting competitiveness. I worked very closely in my previous life in a cooperative securities regulator to try to permit all parts of Canada to participate in a uniform system, reducing some of the competitiveness, duplication, improving our overall costs, and some of those that held back were Quebec and Alberta primarily, but we had a passport system to try to facilitate some of those engagements. And so I have three questions. And my first one, if I may, is to Shana Furlong. This is in regards to foreign direct investment. Canada is actually pretty much at the top. I mean, we've slid since 2019, but we still rank as one of the top destinations for foreign direct investment because our tax rate is low, our stability, our predictability, our legal system, our adaptability. Canada has been sourcing foreign direct investment of late, contrary to the opposition party who's opposing some of those greater investments that are coming our way in the automotive sector specifically. But we need to improve scaling and monetization. We are certainly competing against the U.S. for some of this. I want to understand, if you may, and I know that Michelle Girard was asked this question, but I want to ask you specifically on the importance of having an arm's length regulatory system where you don't interfere with the Ontario Securities Commissions or with the Bank of Canada or any of these bodies that are there to protect all of us from interference. Can you comment on that, please?
Thank you for the question. Absolutely, I agree that a strong regulatory framework and a Canada that is relatively free of corruption is absolutely necessary for strong foreign direct investment. We do get concerned when we see, record sell-offs on the TSX. Even our own pension plans are invested largely in other jurisdictions. We need Canada to be attracting foreign direct investment, not just with public incentives, but because we're a certain environment to do business in. It is a relatively safe investment. And we need to also see that growth in industry outside of real estate. Absolutely, housing is very necessary, but we have seen a lot of investment in Canada, in the Lower Mainland and British Columbia specifically, centered in the real estate industry. We would like to see a lot of job creation.
Actually, that's a great point. And I do want to talk a little bit about, BC has a lot of the small cap business, right, that we have established, and it's critical, especially in the formation of new ventures. And of course, we have a lot of innovation superclusters across Canada that are now developing, making us at the top. Can you share with this committee the embedded costs of carbon pricing that has been established by international bodies? Like, we are trading partners and we have trading agreements with many other jurisdictions. If we don't participate in a carbon price internally, we're going to face it externally. Can you share your thoughts on that?
I'm afraid I have to get you off because Mr. Sousa did not leave you any time, but perhaps we can get back to it another round, or perhaps I'll just let everyone know. I know we've left a lot of questions hanging. I welcome you all to provide the writings and answers to our clerk, and he will make sure they come out to the committee. We'll all go to Mrs. Vignola, please, for 2.5.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Girard, in a former life, I was a teacher. I was an economics teacher, among other things. And I also was an English teacher, and there are some French expressions that are different in English, but sometimes they're translated literally, because sometimes we think that so when we talk about economic sandboxes, we're not talking about bac à sable in French or boîte à sable. It's not. a literal sandbox. So it's people who are listening, and there are business owners listening, and when they hear in French, bac à sable, and they don't know what you're talking about. And so there are many definitions for regulatory sandbox. So can you explain what this exactly means? Yes, thank you for this great question.
Évidemment, c'est pas un carré de sable.
So no, it's not a literal sandbox, of course. Here we're talking about, when we talk about regulatory sandbox, it's a place where we run experiments. So we're going to test out different approaches to comply with an act. So regulations is what we use. So we try to see how we're going to comply with an act. And that's what it means. So it does allow regulatory authorities to open the door to invite people. And then we have prototypes, we have pilot projects, we look at the result. Is it clear? I wanted it to be clear for everyone. It was clear for me. And from the beginning, I hear you talk about consultation, partnership, to undo silos. And when we talk about these regulations, sometimes we feel that people want to go back to a type of pure economic liberalism, and that's not your position. Just to confirm, you are in a type of new paradigm here, a new socioeconomic procedural paradigm. I'm not really sure how to explain. Yes, and the reason why we're intervening today is because we're concerned by the impacts of technology, digital technologies, on people, on our democracies. And so if we say that we want to set out standards in order to reduce these negative impacts, yes, okay, I'm finished. So we're not going back in the past. We want for these systems, these products, be safe. We want them to be safe for our physical and mental health.
Mr. Backrack, please.
Mr. Chair. A question for Ms. Furlong. I found the points around net direct foreign investment to be interesting because, of course, there are two components here. There's the amount that Canadian firms are investing in other countries, and there's the amount that other firms from other countries are investing here in Canada. And the two aspects of my question, first of all, Canada is home to some 60% of the world's mining companies. And I think that has to do with our unique treatment of those companies, either tax-wise or regulatory-wise. And it seems that would skew the number quite significantly. The second point is that you noted direct foreign investment in real estate, which I think has had, when it comes to residential real estate, has had a really detrimental effect on the price of housing and the housing crisis in the Lower Mainland. And so if we're to see more direct foreign investment in real estate through things like real estate investment trusts, in my mind, that would be something that runs counter to our national interest. Should we be looking to other metrics to describe the health of our economy? It seems like these are two inherently problematic aspects of using net direct foreign investment.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Backrack. As I mentioned, we would like to see that foreign direct investment outside of real estate as well. We have seen quite a bit of money flocking to the real estate sector, especially residential real estate, because returns have historically, in the past 2 decades, been very, very strong and more certain with less regulatory oversight than, honestly, industries that are very job creating. We would like to see that investment be in industries where we're creating Canadian jobs, people are employed, and we're generating a greater GDP for the country. I think foreign direct investment is one metric that we should be looking at, but certainly if we're seeing even Canadian pension plans seeing greater returns from other jurisdictions, we would like Canada to be competitive and to be attracting that investment here. We have quite a few companies that could be scaling, and we may be able to attract more.
If I understand you correctly, in the 2 seconds I have left, if Canadian firms and Canadian pension plans were investing here in Canada it would in fact increase our net direct foreign investment, like the ratio, because fewer Canadian firms would be investing outside the country. And to me, that seems like a much more beneficial approach to look at it, as opposed to trying to encourage more foreign firms to be investing in our country, which comes with some of the drawbacks that we've mentioned. Anyway, I know I'm out of time, Mr. Chair. Thanks for your forbearance.
Thanks. And again, Mrs. Furlong, maybe you can provide us a response in writing. Last two rounds, Mrs. Block, and then we're going to go to Mr. Kuzmierczak. Mrs. Block, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. In my last intervention, I made the observation regarding the current government's propensity to introduce very vague or deeply flawed legislation, leaving a lot of the heavy lifting to the bureaucrats when it comes to introducing regulations that actually get less scrutiny by the public or by stakeholders than legislation does. And so, Ms. Furlong, I'm wondering if you are aware of the requirement for federal organizations to apply a small business lens to proposed regulations to identify and take into account the needs of small businesses when designing regulations. And are your members also aware of that requirement? And do they have the opportunity to provide to the federal government that small business lens?
Thank you so much for that question. I was not aware of that requirement, but I will be doing more research on that and look forward to learning more.
Thank you. Over to Mr. DeThomasis. I appreciated some of the suggestions that you provided or solutions that you provided in your opening remarks, not only including the free trade zones, but also the trusted carrier solution or the fast pass solution. And I would ask that you could perhaps explain a little bit more about that, if there are other jurisdictions that do in fact have those solutions available to industry and businesses. And then also if you can comment on the targeted regulatory reviews where the TBS and regulators are required to seek stakeholder input on a set of themes to develop regulatory roadmaps that propose changes to the legislative, regulatory, and policy regime.
Sure, thank you. The Trusted Carrier Program, we're familiar with that through our work with the automakers and different OEMs. They have a program where the carriers, they're verified digital carriers, so they've got all their verifications done on the front end, so they're not having to stop in at customs or at various points along the border for verification of their loads. They do this in the Windsor area on a daily basis for the movement of finished vehicles back and forth across the border. We think that programs similar to this for other verified carriers that it could be pre-selected, that you could use for movement of goods back and forth across the border for other goods other than vehicles that could be steel, aluminum, steel coil, would help to expedite the movement of these goods and increase our competitiveness in the space. As far as the free trade zone is, we do have a designation in the Windsor area as a free trade zone, but I don't believe it's being fully utilized. There are some significant challenges when it's in terms of different types of commodities that we handle at Moreterm, such as steel, aluminum, and steel plate. We would like to have that designation looked at once again to see if we can incorporate some of the different commodities that we handle and how we can encourage the movement of those goods under that free trade zone. As far as your last question, I'm not aware of any of the CBSA, I believe it was, regulations or anything to that effect, so I couldn't answer that question. My apologies.
Thank you very much.
Do you have a minute left? Okay. We'll go over back to Mr. Kuzmierczak, please.
Thank you, Chair, and I do appreciate that I get a chance to follow up on some of my previous questions and have a little bit more extra time. Speaking with our businesses, our small businesses, our cargo hubs is really, really important just to get feedback in terms of how we can improve things, make things more streamlined, take some of the administrative burdens off of our small businesses. And so this year, actually, a couple months ago, we had the trade minister. We brought the trade minister, Mary Ng, down to Moorterm, and also the ambassador to the U.S. Ambassador Hillman as well, too, to listen to some of the challenges that Moorterm and other shipping hubs, transport hubs face. And in that meeting, you had mentioned some of the administrative hurdles that you face. Some of it is as simple as making some changes in some of the paperwork to free up that trade. Can you maybe expound a little bit on some of those small changes, some of that low-hanging fruit that could be made, introduced to help free up trade and reduce some of those that red tape and those barriers for businesses?
Sure, appreciate that. Yeah, we appreciated the visit by your group, and I think it was a good exercise in showing them the benefits of doing trade in Windsor and with our proximity to Detroit and the heartland of America from a manufacturing perspective. The feedback that we're getting from customers is that they love to bring cargo into Windsor, but the administrative support that's required to move that cargo piece by piece back into the U.S. and the amount of paperwork that's required is prohibitive. We've offered to perform those duties as a all-in-one service that Moorterm could provide the customer, and we would exercise that paperwork. But when we attempted that, we understood their challenges and the difficulties associated with that because it was very laborious and very, very intensive. What we would propose to do is to custom clear the entire cargo once it lands in Windsor, and then the movement of those goods through a verified carrier could move those goods back into the U.S. For final destination. And I think it would just simplify paperwork, but it would still track the different commodities going across the border. And this would alleviate all those administrative tasks and the challenges associated with the movement of those goods.
Excellent. Really appreciate your answer. And Mr. DeTomasis, do you think that this would be something that would be a good candidate for the regulatory sandbox approach, where in essence we could maybe conduct a pilot project in Windsor to see if it could be expanded later on throughout? Do you think this would be a good candidate for a regulatory sandbox approach?
I think it would be a great pilot project for Windsor. Leveraging the new Gordie Howe International Bridge with all of the different capacities that are going to be increased at the bridge through CBSA. We would be a willing partner to partake in any of those exercises to see how we could increase trade across the border.
Moses, I would encourage you and invite you to actually submit for this committee your thoughts in writing on some of the ideas where we can, again, reduce some of that administrative burden and even how we can incorporate a pilot project into a regulatory sandbox in terms of, again, removing some of that paperwork, as you mentioned, that is onerous. Minister Anand was in Chicago. The president of the Treasury was in Chicago and Washington this month, talking about reviving and strengthening the Regulatory Cooperation Council, which would help streamline and harmonize regulations that are cross-border. And of course, $3.3 billion worth of trade crosses our border every single day. This is important. About a quarter of that passes through our community in Windsor, Essex. I wanted to ask you, how important is it to revive the Regulatory Cooperation Council and make it robust, knowing that, again, cross-border trade between the U.S. and Canada is so important?
I think it's very, very important. I would ask the committee to also look at other partners that bring trade into the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Seaway. And those are different organizations such as Highway H2O and the St. Lawrence Seaway Corporation. they would be more than willing partners to look at any type of pilot program which would increase trade through the Great Lakes.
Okay, thank you.
Let's do one more because you can take Mrs. Block's 45 seconds.
No, I appreciate that. No, thank you. Thank you very much. And
Hurry.
no, this is great. And I just wanted to say, I wanted to thank the chair for, again, bringing this issue to committee, because this is something that I think unites all of us here around the table. This is really a bipartisan issue, nonpartisan issue. And I just wanted to say thank you for bringing this issue here to this committee, because I really do think that it is central, very important, and it is central to the work of this committee. So I just wanted to say thank you, Chair, for bringing this forward. Yeah. I wanted to ask you, Mr. Tomasis, as well, too. You mentioned, for example, that there already exists a foreign trade zone in Windsor. We know that there are many FTZs across Canada. So I just wanted you to maybe expound a little bit on where you think we could possibly expand the FTC program. And same question, because you mentioned sufferance warehouses. We know those already exist as well, too. If you can maybe speak to how we can build upon the existing sufferance warehouses and foreign trade zones that exist.
Just quickly, if you can, sir.
Sure. I'll make it quick. I think there's opportunities there that could increase trade and our competitiveness. I think there are some challenges with the current structure of the sufferance warehouse. And I think it's a worthwhile effort to look at those current regulations that are associated with sufferance warehouses and see how we can bring them up to date to meet the customer's needs as of today. And with all the reshoring efforts that are going on, there may need to be some changes made so that it can increase capacity, increase competitiveness, and that's about it. I think it needs to be looked at once again.
Great. Thank you very much, members. Thanks for your patience as we dealt with some of the IT issues. Special thanks to our clerk for juggling all of that. Witnesses, thank you very much. It was very informative. Sorry we had to cut you off so much. I do encourage you, though, if you have any further responses that you want to expand on, to please send them in to the committee. Mr. Girard had sent in a report in advance. If you do have any reports that you wish to share with us, please feel free to spam us with it. We'll find them very interesting, especially around dealing with, and we didn't get into it, federal, provincial issues. Of course, we are a federation, and I know that's a lot of our issues. If you have any comments, suggestions, reports on that, I highly would appreciate if you'd send them to the clerk. Thank you once again, everyone. With that, we are adjourned.